the mechanisms just mentioned. The understanding of these properties will enhance the use of nanoparticles in novel applications in various fields such as surface engineering, tribology, nanomanufacturing, and nanofabrication. Techniques used. Steinitz in 1943 used the microindentation technique to test the hardness of microparticles, and now nanoindentation has been employed to measure elastic properties of particles at about 5 micron level. These protocols are frequently used to calculate the mechanical characteristics of nanoparticles via atomic force microscopy, AFM, techniques. To measure the elastic modulus, indentation data is obtained via AFM force displacement curves being converted to force indentation curves. Hooke's law is used to determine the cantilever deformation and depth of the tip, and in conclusion, the pressure equation can be written as P equals K, C, C0. C, cantilever deformation. C0, deflection offset. AFM allows us to obtain a high-resolution image of multiple types of surfaces, while the tip of the cantilever can be used to obtain information about mechanical properties. Computer simulations are also being progressively used to test theories and complement experimental studies. The most used computer method is molecular dynamics simulation, which uses Newton's equations of motion for the atoms or molecules in the system. Other techniques such as direct probe method are used to determine the adhesive properties of nanomaterials. Both the technique and simulation are coupled with transmission electron microscope, TEM, and AFM techniques to provide results. Mechanical properties of common nanomaterials classes. Crystalline metal nanomaterials. Dislocations are one of the major contributors toward elastic properties within nanomaterials similar to bulk crystalline materials. Despite the traditional view of there being no dislocations in nanomaterials, Ramos' experimental work has shown that the hardness of gold nanoparticles is much higher than their bulk counterparts, as there are stacking faults and dislocations forming that activate multiple strengthening mechanisms in the material. Through these experiments, more research has shown that via nanoindentation techniques, material strength, compressive stress, increases under compression with decreasing particle size, because of nucleating dislocations. These dislocations have been observed using TEM techniques, coupled with nanoindentation. Silicon nanoparticles' strength and hardness are 4 times more than the value of the bulk material. The resistance to pressure applied can be attributed to the line defects inside the particles as well as a dislocation that provides strengthening of the mechanical properties of the nanomaterial. Furthermore, the addition of nanoparticles strengthens a matrix because the pinning of particles inhibits grain growth. This refines the grain, and hence improves the mechanical properties. However, not all additions of nanomaterials lead to an increase in properties, for example nano-Cu. But this is attributed to the inherent properties of the material being weaker than the matrix. Non-metallic nanoparticles and nanomaterials. Size-dependent behavior of mechanical properties is still not clear in the case of polymer nanomaterials. However, in one research by Lahouage they found that the compressive moduli of polystyrene nanoparticles were found to be less than that of the bulk counterparts. This can be associated with the functional groups being hydrated. Furthermore, non-metallic nanomaterials can lead to agglomerates forming inside the matrix they are being added to, and hence decrease the mechanical properties by leading to fracture under even low mechanical loads, such as the addition of CNTs. The agglomerates will act as slip planes as well as planes in which cracks can easily propagate. 9. However, most organic nanomaterials are flexible, and these and the mechanical properties such as hardness etc. are not dominant. Nanowires and nanotubes. The elastic moduli of some nanowires, namely lead and silver, decrease with increasing diameter. This has been associated with surface stress, oxidation layer, and surface roughness. However, the elastic behavior of ZNO nanowires does not get affected by surface effects, but their fracture properties do. So, it is generally dependent on material behavior and their bonding as well. The reason why mechanical properties of nanomaterials are still a hot topic for research is that measuring the mechanical properties of individual nanoparticles is a complicated method, involving multiple control factors. Nonetheless, atomic force microscopy has been widely used to measure the mechanical properties of nanomaterials. Adhesion and friction of nanoparticles. When talking about the application of a material, adhesion and friction play a critical role in determining the outcome of the application. Therefore, it is critical to see how these properties also get affected by the size of a material. Again, AFM is a technique most used to measure these properties and to determine the adhesive strength of nanoparticles to any solid surface, along with the colloidal probe technique and other chemical properties. Furthermore, the forces playing a role in providing these adhesive properties to nanomaterials are either the electrostatic forces, VDW, capillary forces, solvation forces, structure force, etc. It has been found that the addition of nanomaterials in bulk materials substantially increases their adhesive capabilities by increasing their strength through various bonding mechanisms. Nanomaterials dimension approaches zero, which means that the fraction of the particle's surface to overall atoms increases. Along with surface effects, the movement of nanoparticles also plays a role in dictating their mechanical properties, such as shearing capabilities. The movement of particles can be observed under TEM. For example, the movement behavior of most two nanoparticles' dynamic contact was directly observed in situ, which led to the conclusion that fuller ends can shear via rolling or sliding. However, observing these properties is again a very complicated process due to multiple contributing factors. Applications specific to mechanical properties. 1. Lubrication. 2. Nanomanufacturing. 3. Coatings. Uniformity, edit. The chemical processing and synthesis of high-performance technological components for the private, industrial and military sectors requires the use of high-purity ceramics, polymera, glass ceramics, and composite materials. In condensed bodies formed from fine powders, the irregular sizes and shapes of nanoparticles in a typical powder often lead to non-uniform packing morphologies that result in packing density variations in the powder compact. Uncontrolled agglomeration of powders due to attractive van der Waals forces can also give rise to microstructural inhomogeneities. Differential stresses that develop as a result of non-uniform drying shrinkage are directly related to the rate at which the solvent can be removed, and thus highly dependent upon the distribution of porosity. Such stresses have been associated with a plastic to brittle transition in consolidated bodies, and can yield to crack propagation in the unfired body if not relieved. In addition, any fluctuations in packing density in the compact as it is prepared for the kill are often amplified during the sintering process, yielding inhomogeneous densification. Some pores and other structural defects associated with density variations have been shown to play a detrimental role in the sintering process by growing and thus limiting endpoint densities. Differential stresses arising from inhomogeneous densification have also been shown to result in the propagation of internal cracks, thus becoming the strength-controlling flaws. It would therefore appear desirable to process a material in such a way that it is physically uniform with regard to the distribution of components and porosity, rather than using particle size distributions which will maximize the green density. The containment of a uniformly dispersed assembly of strongly interacting particles in suspension requires total control over particle-particle interactions. A number of dispersants such as ammonium citrate, aqueous, and imidazoline or ethyl alcohol, known aqueous, are promising solutions as possible additives for enhanced dispersion and deglomeration. Monodisperse nanoparticles and colloids provide this potential. Monodisperse powders of colloidal silica, for example, may therefore be stabilized sufficiently to ensure a high degree of order in the colloidal crystal or polycrystalline colloidal solid which results from aggregation. The degree of order appears to be limited by the time and space allowed for longer-range correlations to be established. Such defective polycrystalline colloidal structures would appear to be the basic elements of submicrometer colloidal materials science, and, therefore, provide the first step in developing a more rigorous understanding of the mechanisms involved in microstructural evolution in high-performance materials and components. Nanomaterials in articles, patents, and products, edit. The quantitative analysis of nanomaterials showed that nanoparticles, nanotubes, nanocrystalline materials, nanocomposites, and graphene have been mentioned in 400,000, 181,000, 144,000, 140,000, and 119,000 ISI indexed articles, respectively, by September 2018. As far as patents are concerned, nanoparticles, nanotubes, nanocomposites, graphene, and nanowires have been played a role in 45,600, 32,100, 12,700, 12,500, and 11,800 patents, respectively. Monitoring approximately 7,000 commercial nano-based products available on global markets revealed that the properties of around 2,330 products have been enabled or enhanced aided by nanoparticles. Liposomes, nanofibers, nanocolloids, and aerogels were also of the most common nanomaterials in consumer products. The European Union Observatory for Nanomaterials, EUON, has produced a database, Nanodata, that provides information on specific patents, products, and research publications on nanomaterials. Health and Safety, edit. Main article, Health and Safety Hazards of Nanomaterials. This section needs to be updated. The reason given is, 1. Quote, nanotechnology products classified, 2019-2023, according with industrial areas, electronics, medicine, construction, cosmetics etc. Please help update this article to reflect recent events or newly available information. March 2024. World Health Organization Guidelines, edit. The World Health Organization, WHO, published a guideline on protecting workers from potential risk of manufactured nanomaterials at the end of 2017. WHO used a precautionary approach as one of its guiding principles. This means that exposure has to be reduced, despite uncertainty about the adverse health effects, when there are reasonable indications to do so. This is highlighted by recent scientific studies that demonstrate a capability of nanoparticles to cross cell barriers and interact with cellular structures. In addition, the hierarchy of controls was an important guiding principle. This means that when there is a choice between control measures, those measures that are closer to the root of the problem should always be preferred over measures that put a greater burden on workers, such as the use of personal protective equipment, PPE. WHO commissioned systematic reviews for all important issues to assess the current state of the science and to inform the recommendations according to the process set out in the WHO Handbook for Guideline Development. The recommendations were rated as strong or conditional depending on the quality of the scientific evidence, values and preferences, and costs related to the recommendation. The WHO guidelines contain the following recommendations for safe handling of manufactured nanomaterials, MNMs. Assess health hazards of MNMs. 1. WHO recommends assigning hazard classes to all MNMs according to the Globally Harmonized System, GHS, of classification and labeling of chemicals for use in safety data sheets. For a limited number of MNMs, this information is made available in the guidelines. Strong recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 2. WHO recommends updating safety data sheets with MNM-specific hazard information or indicating which toxicological endpoints did not have adequate testing available. Strong recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 3. For the respirable fibers and granular biopersistent particles groups, the GDG suggests using the available classification of MNMs for provisional classification of nanomaterials of the same group. Conditional recommendation, low quality evidence. B. Assess exposure to MNMs. 1. WHO suggests assessing workers' exposure in workplaces with methods similar to those used for the proposed specific occupational exposure limit, OEL, value of the MNM. Conditional recommendation, low quality evidence. 2. Because there are no specific regulatory OEL values for MNMs in workplaces, WHO suggests assessing whether workplace exposure exceeds a proposed OEL value for the MNM. A list of proposed OEL values is provided in an annex of the guidelines. The chosen OEL should be at least as protective as a legally mandated OEL for the bulk form of the material. Conditional recommendation, low quality evidence. 3. If specific OELs for MNMs are not available in workplaces, WHO suggests a stepwise approach for inhalation exposure with, first, an assessment of the potential for exposure, second, conducting basic exposure assessment, and third, conducting a comprehensive exposure assessment such as those proposed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, or COMITE European Denormalization, the European Committee for Standardization, Center. Conditional recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 4. For dermal exposure assessment, WHO found that there was insufficient evidence to recommend one method of dermal exposure assessment over another. See control exposure to MNMs. 1. Based on a precautionary approach, WHO recommends focusing control of exposure on preventing inhalation exposure with the aim of reducing it as much as possible. Strong recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 2. WHO recommends reduction of exposures to a range of MNMs that have been consistently measured in workplaces, especially during cleaning and maintenance, collecting material from reaction vessels and feeding MNMs into the production process. In the absence of toxicological information, WHO recommends implementing the highest level of controls to prevent workers from any exposure. When more information is available, WHO recommends taking a more tailored approach. Strong recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 3. WHO recommends taking control measures based on the principle of hierarchy of controls, meaning that the first control measure should be to eliminate the source of exposure before implementing control measures that are more dependent on worker involvement, with PPE being used only as a last resort. According to this principle, engineering controls should be used when there is a high level of inhalation exposure or when there is no, or very little, toxicological information available. In the absence of appropriate engineering controls, PPE should be used, especially respiratory protection, as part of a respiratory protection program that includes fit testing. Strong recommendation, moderate quality evidence. 4. WHO suggests preventing dermal exposure by occupational hygiene measures such as surface cleaning, and the use of appropriate gloves. Conditional recommendation, low-quality evidence. 5. When assessment and measurement by a workplace safety expert is not available, who suggests using control banding for nanomaterials to select exposure control measures in the workplace. Owing to a lack of studies, who cannot recommend one method of control banding over another, conditional recommendation, very low quality evidence. For health surveillance, who could not make a recommendation for targeted MNM-specific health surveillance programs over existing health surveillance programs that are already in use owing to the lack of evidence. Who considers training of workers and worker involvement in health and safety issues to be best practice but could not recommend one form of training of workers over another, or one form of worker involvement over another, owing to the lack of studies available. It is expected that there will be considerable progress in validated measurement methods and risk assessment, and who expects to update these guidelines in 5 years' time, in 2022. Other guidance, edit. Because nanotechnology is a recent development, the health and safety effects of exposures to nanomaterials, and what levels of exposure may be acceptable, are subjects of ongoing research. Of the possible hazards, inhalation exposure appears to present the most concern. Animal studies indicate that carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofibers can cause pulmonary effects including inflammation, granulomas, and pulmonary fibrosis, which were of similar or greater potency when compared with other known fibrogenic materials such as silica, asbestos, and ultrafine carbon black. Acute inhalation exposure of healthy animals to biodegradable inorganic nanomaterials have not demonstrated significant toxicity effects. Although the extent to which animal data may predict clinically significant lung effects in workers is not known, the toxicity seen in the short-term animal studies indicate a need for protective action for workers exposed to these nanomaterials, although no reports of actual adverse health effects in workers using or producing these nanomaterials were known as of 2013. Additional concerns include skin contact and ingestion exposure, and dust explosion hazards. Elimination and substitution are the most desirable approaches to hazard control. While the nanomaterials themselves often cannot be eliminated or substituted with conventional materials, it may be possible to choose properties of the nanoparticles such as size, shape, functionalization, surface charge, solubility, agglomeration, and aggregation state to improve their toxicological properties while retaining the desired functionality. Handling procedures can also be improved, for example, using a nanomaterial slurry or suspension in a liquid solvent instead of a dry powder will reduce dust exposure. Engineering controls are physical changes to the workplace that isolate workers from hazards, mainly ventilation systems such as fume hoods, glove boxes, biosafety cabinets, and vented balance enclosures. Administrative controls are changes to workers' behavior to mitigate a hazard, including training on best practices for safe handling, storage, and disposal of nanomaterials, proper awareness of hazards through labeling and warning signage, and encouraging a general safety culture. Personal protective equipment must be worn on the worker's body and is the least desirable option for controlling hazards. Personal protective equipment normally used for typical chemicals are also appropriate for nanomaterials, including long pants, long-sleeve shirts, and closed-toed shoes, and the use of safety gloves, goggles, and impervious laboratory coats. In some circumstances, respirators may be used. Exposure assessment is a set of methods used to monitor contaminant release and exposures to workers. These methods include personal sampling, where samplers are located in the personal breathing zone of the worker, often attached to a shirt collar to be as close to the nose and mouth as possible, and area forward/background sampling, where they are placed at static locations. The assessment should use both particle counters, which monitor the real-time quantity of nanomaterials and other background particles, and filter-based samples, which can be used to identify the nanomaterial, usually using electron microscopy and elemental analysis. As of 2016, quantitative occupational exposure limits have not been determined for most nanomaterials. The U.S. National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has determined non-regulatory recommended exposure limits for carbon nanotubes, carbon nanofibers, and ultrafine titanium dioxide. Agencies and organizations from other countries, including the British Standards Institute and the Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in Germany, have established OELs for some nanomaterials, and some companies have supplied OELs for their products. Nanoscale diagnostics. Nanotechnology has been making headlines in the medical field, being responsible for biomedical imaging. The unique optical, magnetic and chemical properties of materials on the nanoscale has allowed the development of imaging probes with multifunctionality such as better contrast enhancement, better spatial information, controlled biodistribution, and multimodal imaging across various scanning devices. These developments have had advantages such as being able to detect the location of tumors and inflammations, accurate assessment of disease progression, and personalized medicine. Silicon nanoparticles can be classified into solid, non-porous, and mesoporous. They have large surface area, hydrophilic surface, and chemical and physical stabilities. Silicon nanoparticles are made by the use of the Stover process, which is the hydrolysis of silyl ethers such as tetrethylsilicate into silanols, SiO, using ammonia in a mixture of water and alcohol followed by the condensation of silanols into 52,000 nm silica particles. The size of the particle can be controlled by varying the concentration of silyl ether and alcohol or the microemulsion method. Mesoporous silicon nanoparticles are synthesized by the sol-gel process. They have pores that range in diameter from 2 nm to 50 nm. They are synthesized in a water-based solution in the presence of a base catalyst and a pore-forming agent known as a surfactant. Surfactants are molecules that present the particularity to have a hydrophobic tail, alkyl chain, and a hydrophilic head, charged group, such as a quaternariamine for example. As these surfactants are added to a water-based solution, they will coordinate to form micelles with increasing concentration in order to stabilize the hydrophobic tails. Varying the pH of the solution and composition of the solvents, and the addition of certain swelling agents can control the pore size. Their hydrophilic surface is what makes silicon nanoparticles so important and allows them to carry out functions such as drug and gene delivery, bioimaging and therapy. In order for this application to be successful, assorted surface functional groups are necessary and can be added either by the co-condensation process during preparation or by post-surface modification. The high surface area of silicon nanoparticles allows them to carry much larger amounts of the desired drug than through conventional methods like polymers and liposomes. It allows for site-specific targeting, especially in the treatment of cancer. Once the particles have reached their destination, they can act as a reporter, release a compound, or be remotely heated to damage biological structures in close proximity. Targeting is typically accomplished by modifying the surface of the nanoparticle with a chemical or biological compound. They accumulate at tumor sites through enhanced permeability retention, EPR, where the tumor vessels accelerate the delivery of the nanoparticles directly into the tumor. The porous shell of the silica allows control over the rate at which the drug diffuses out of the nanoparticle. The shell can be modified to have an affinity for the drug, or even to be triggered by pH, heat, light, salts, or other signaling molecules. Silicon nanoparticles are also used in bioimaging because they can accommodate fluorescent/MI/PET/SPECT contrast agents and drug/DNA molecules to their adaptable surface and pores. This is made possible by using the silicon nanoparticle as a vector for the expression of fluorescent proteins. Several different types of fluorescent probes, like cyanine dyes, methylviologen, or semiconductor quantum dots can be conjugated to silicon nanoparticles and